First of all, Acts 13, verse 51. Remember, they were in Antioch. Verse 51 of Acts 13 says, "They shook off the dust from their feet against them and went to Iconium." Chapter 14, verse 1. "Now at Iconium they entered together into the Jewish synagogue and spoke in such a way that a great number of both Jews and Greeks believed. But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. So they remained for a long time, speaking boldly for the Lord, who bore witness to the word of his grace, granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. But the people of the city were divided. Some sided with the Jews, and some with the apostles. When an attempt was made by both Gentiles and Jews with the rulers to mistreat them and to stone them, they learned of it and fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia, and to the surrounding country. And there they continued to preach the gospel." You'll want to follow along in your handout this morning. We'll begin on the left side, the Iconium side of your handout. And in verse 1, as we just read, they came into Iconium and went to the synagogue. So we have the same theme that we learned last Sunday. This was Gentile mission, but with Jewish priority. And then next, we want to note three different types of witness here in Acts chapter 14. You see there are three little triangles over on the right side of your handout that correspond to them. I'll explain the little triangles later on. But for now, we're on the first of those. So look with me, Acts 14, verse 1. What did they do when they came into the Jewish synagogue? They spoke. And verse 3 says they were speaking boldly for the Lord, who bore witness to the word of his grace. So in the blank on your handout, there was witness by the spoken word, and particularly it was the word of Jesus' grace. They were telling the residents of Iconium about Jesus and his grace. But then there was another kind of witness that happened. See it in verse 3? As they were speaking boldly for the Lord, it says, who bore witness? Now who's who? Jesus. The Lord bore witness to the word of his grace. They were talking about Jesus, and Jesus himself bore witness by granting signs and wonders. Now, the most common type of signs and wonders in the book of Acts is healing. There's the reference here to him granting these signs and wonders by their hands. So maybe this is talking about healing. But regardless, Jesus was using his risen authority to verify this was his word. This was his gospel. This was real. As we said down in Cyprus, it's as if Jesus just came to town and he wanted to make sure they knew it. The author of Hebrews looked back on this time when he wrote, he remembered when the message of salvation was confirmed to them by those who had heard Jesus. So the people who had been there and seen and heard Jesus confirmed the message of salvation to these others. And the writer of Hebrews says, at the same time, God also testified by signs and wonders. So God worked as the witnesses of Jesus told others, God worked to say, this is real. This is what really happened. This is the real truth. Paul told the Corinthians that the signs of a true apostle had been performed among them with signs and wonders and mighty works. So this was part of how God, through Jesus, by the Spirit, confirmed that first generation of witnesses as they testified about the truth. So the second type of witness is the witness by Jesus' works, the signs and wonders. And then, as you can see on your chart, in Lystra, we're going to add a third type, but we'll get to that later. Let's continue in Iconium. When Paul and Barnabas spoke about Jesus' grace, and Jesus worked signs and wonders, what was the response? Well, what do you expect the response to be, based on the pattern we've seen so far? You expect some people to get saved, and you expect some people to get mad. So that's just what happened. If we look down at verse 1, the end of the verse says, a great number of both Jews and Greeks believed. So the first response was faith. But then verse 2 refers to the unbelieving Jews. So one response was faith. The other response was unbelief, belief and unbelief. Okay, but if you go look up that word unbelieving, see it in verse 2? If you go look up that word unbelieving in the dictionary, not the English dictionary, the Greek dictionary, it says that the word means disobedient. That's very simply what it means, disobedient. So why didn't the translators say the disobedient Jews stirred up the Gentiles? Well, it's because this word disobedient is used several times in the New Testament as the opposite of faith. Two possible responses. You can believe or you can disobey. John 3:36 is a verse that you might know that uses that combination of terms. On the one hand, faith. On the other hand, disobedience. What's the point? The point is that unbelief is disobedience. The gospel is not merely an option to consider, it's a command to obey. The Creator says, repent and believe the good news. Now here's why this is important. Because some people think that faith is a feeling and you wait until you feel like believing. And if you don't feel like you maybe think that's true or you don't feel like believing, then you don't need to worry about it until maybe sometime you feel like it. But what the Bible emphasizes is that faith is actually an act of obedience to the God who has revealed the truth and commanded us to repent and believe. Now, it's true that a person can be exploring matters of faith. They can be trying to learn about the facts before they believe. But you cannot wait around until you feel like believing. That is disobedience. You have to obey the gospel by believing. So in Iconium, there was, on one hand, faith and belief, and on the other hand, unbelief, or if you haven't put it on your handout yet, disobedience. Unbelief or disobedience. And actually what some translations do to try to capture that is they use the phrase refused to believe, which is a great way to do it, I think. They refused to believe. With the division then, if you continue down your handout, the next thing that came was opposition. Verse 2 says that those who refused to believe stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. Now, it doesn't tell us how that happened, but we know the ways this can happen, right? You have had this happen sometime in your life. You have had somebody poison somebody else's mind against you by whatever they said about you. So maybe they were attacking the message, maybe they were slandering the messengers. Either way, it quickly became uncomfortable to be a Christian in Iconium. So what did Paul and Barnabas do? This is a great sequence of thoughts. Verse 2, the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. So, verse 3, Paul and Barnabas remained for a long time. Isn't that a great flow of thought? There's trouble. There's opposition. What shall we do? Let's stay here a long time. And you know what? It's not the last time that's going to happen in the book of Acts. We're going to get that in Ephesus when great opposition is going to arise, and so they're going to stay for a year and a half. We're going to get that in Corinth where great opposition arises, so they're going to stay for 2 years. So on your handout, they responded to the opposition with longevity, first of all, longevity, and second of all, boldness. Longevity requires boldness, because without boldness, they would have left when it got tough. Isn't that all of our nature? When a relationship gets hard, when a situation gets hard, when a job gets hard, our first tendency is to just get out, get away from it. But the Spirit can give us the boldness for longevity. And you know, God can move people wherever He wants, but when you're serving the Lord, there are rich benefits when you can stay in the same place and serve the same people for a long time. And so may God give us in all areas of our life longevity through the boldness of the Spirit. So there was opposition in Iconium, but by the Spirit's help, Paul and Barnabas met that opposition with longevity and boldness. Yet, that's hardly the end of the story, because in verse 5, an attempt was made to mistreat and stone Paul and Barnabas. This wasn't just an idea or a plan or a scheme like we see some other places in Acts. They attempted to stone them. Remember, we saw last week, Paul talked about his suffering in Antioch and Iconium and these places. So there was an actual attempt at physical harm or even murder here. And what did they do? What does it say they did? In verse 6, they learned of it and got out of town. They fled. And so longevity is really important, but there are times when it's right to flee danger. I think there are at least 4 other examples in the book of Acts of getting away from physical danger there. So there is a time to stay, and there is a time to get away from the danger. But even though they needed to flee the danger, they could still be, we've got a word we want to put down there in the bottom of that column on your handout, and it comes from verse 7. So look at verse 6. Look at the end of verse 5. The end of 5, they try to kill them. Verse 6, they flee. And verse 7, they continued to preach the gospel as they fled and where they fled. So the word is persistence. Yes, there was flight, but there was also persistence. There's a godly way to say, fine then. If you won't let me do ministry here, I'm going to do ministry over there. If you won't let me talk about the gospel here, I'll go talk about the gospel somewhere else. So, and again, I don't have the time to really dig in and apply that, but there are many areas of our lives in which we need Spirit-filled persistence. All right, so that's the story from Iconium. Now, let's add some of the events of Lystra, because as we just read in verse 6, after they had to flee from Iconium, they fled, first of all, to Lystra. So let's read now Acts 14, verses 8 through 18. Now at Lystra there was a man sitting who could not use his feet. He was crippled from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul speaking. And Paul, looking intently at him and seeing that he had faith to be made well, said in a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." And he sprang up and began walking. And when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in Lycaonian, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men." Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. And the priest of Zeus, whose temple was at the entrance to the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates and wanted to offer sacrifice with the crowds. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of it, they tore their garments and rushed out into the crowd, crying out, "Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men of like nature with you, and we bring you good news that you should turn from these vain things to a living God who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. In past generations, he allowed all the nations to walk in their own ways, yet he did not leave himself without witness. For he did good by giving you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness. Even with these words, they scarcely restrained the people from offering sacrifice to them." Wow, the gods have come down to us. All right, let's work down our Lystra column now. So in both Iconium and Lystra, we see the Gentile mission, but in Lystra, there's no mention of a synagogue visit. And if you actually look down at verse 19 for a minute, it says, Jews came from Antioch and Iconium to Lystra. So that may mean that there were very few Jews in Lystra and probably no synagogue. That's what goes in your blank. No synagogue, though I realized after I put that as a blank that that's a terrible word to try to spell. Synagogue. Synagogue. There was maybe no synagogue in Lystra, so the message was taken straight to the Gentiles. Then secondly, just as the word was spoken in Iconium, it was spoken in Lystra. That's in verse 7. And at the beginning of verse 9 also, they preached the gospel. Paul was speaking about Jesus. And then, just as Jesus witnessed with his works in Iconium, he did it in Lystra also, because a man was healed. Now let's slow down for a moment and notice a couple things about this healing. First of all, in verse 9, Paul, looking intently at him and seeing that he had faith to be made well. He had faith to be made well. So if you jump down on your chart to verse 9 on the right, faith goes in the blank. In Iconium, there was faith. In Lystra, there was faith to be made well. I think Paul here is functioning as a prophet in the sense of the Old Testament prophets, in the sense of Jesus being able to see this man's heart and see his faith. This was so common in the ministry of Jesus. There's a section in Matthew chapters 8 through 15 in which you have story after story after story. It's like 6 different stories where Jesus sees the faith in people and rejoices in that. That series of stories makes it so clear that, can we say it this way? What attracts Jesus' attention is faith. The simplest faith of the weakest person gets the attention of Jesus, who is honored by that faith. So Paul gazes into the soul of this man, sees his faith. And so Paul says in a loud voice, surely so that lots of people could hear, "Stand up, get up on your feet," which was, of course, the heights of absurdity, because it is hardly as if the man had never thought of getting up on his feet and just needed somebody to mention it to him. He had spent his whole life wishing he could get up on his feet. But Jesus made that man's legs new, and he, what does it say? What does it say he did? He sprang up and began walking. He leaped up. When the prophet Isaiah talked about the future blessings in the age of the Messiah, he said, the lame man will leap like a deer. So on your handout, by the witness by Jesus' works in Lystra, you have healing and springing up. The word springing up is the same word used in John 4:14 when Jesus told the Samaritan woman that he would give her water that would be like a spring of water springing up to eternal life. Who's been to Old Faithful? Oh, look at that. 6 or 8 of you. I've been there several times, and it never seems to not ever get tiring to watch that water and steam suddenly gush 150 feet in the air from that hole in the ground. So I picture, when I read this passage, I'm thinking of several things at once. I picture this man, never been on his feet in his life, and he leaps up, healed through faith. I picture Old Faithful, springing up 150 feet in the air. And then I picture the life of Jesus, like a spring, gushing up inside of me, inside of you, inside of each one who receives new life in Jesus. That's what happens when Jesus works. All right, back to our handout now. How much of the Lystra column have we covered? We've got the Gentile mission, though maybe with no synagogue, the witness by the spoken word, the witness by Jesus' works with the healing and springing up. Let's add that third kind of witness now. We're going to have to jump down a little bit in the text, but look at verse 17. God, it says, did not leave himself without witness, for he did good by giving you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness. This is the witness by common grace. Common grace is God's general goodness to all mankind. We're going to explore that more in Bible study next Sunday morning, so I'm not going to talk about that now. But I want us to notice the three kinds of witness here. The witness of the spoken word about Jesus, that's the one of these three that's our responsibility. The witness through Jesus' works, and then the witness by common grace, the goodness of God that all people should see. And we'll talk about the significance of that in Lystra in just a few minutes. Now, we come to the most intriguing part of the passage. In Iconium, Paul and Barnabas had to deal with opposition. In Lystra, they had to deal with, you see the word on your handout, deification. The people took them to be gods. Verse 11, when the crowds saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in Lycaonian, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men." Barnabas they called Zeus. If you're reading the King James, it's got the Roman name for that god, Jupiter. And Paul they called Hermes, or Mercury, because he was the chief speaker. And the priest of Zeus brought oxen and garlands, and they were going to have a sacrifice. Wow. It was common for the Greeks at this time to believe that their gods showed up in disguise. And so when Paul and Barnabas healed this lame man, they concluded that Paul and Barnabas must be gods in disguise, and they thought they could nail down which gods it was. They thought it was Zeus and Hermes. Now, why those two? Well, ancient art pictures show Zeus as this older, dignified man. You may be seen some of those kind of pictures yourself. Barnabas was almost surely older than Paul, and so maybe there was some identification there. But what verse 12 tells us is that they called Paul Hermes because he was the chief speaker. And we have this reference in ancient Greek literature to Hermes as chief in speech. So there was apparently that connection. And there's one other factor we know about. There's this story in Greek literature centuries before this time, before the time of this story, about Zeus and Hermes visiting the area of Lystra. And that was a story these people probably would have known. So maybe they thought this was happening again. Regardless, their response in verse 11 is, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men." And the priest brought oxen and garlands. Oxen were very expensive. They were reserved for the most important sacrifices. And then garlands, flower crowns. Don't know what that was for. It could have been for the worshipers, because ancient idolaters sometimes wore them. Could have been for Paul and Barnabas. Sometimes they put them on really important people. But then we also have pictures of ancient animals getting ready to be sacrificed with garlands on them. So maybe it was for the poor oxen to wear at their funeral, at their death. Regardless, can you picture this sacrificial party? This impromptu worship service at the gate of Lystra? Because they thought the gods had come to visit? When the Pilgrims came to Massachusetts, the Indians were so awed and amazed by the things that the Europeans had brought with them, guns and windmills and iron plows and so on, that one of the Pilgrim leaders, Roger Williams, wrote this: "There is a general custom among the Indians that when they find anything excellent in men, women, birds, fish, etc., to cry out, 'Manitou,' that is, 'It is a god.' Anything amazing was a god." The human heart, it is quick to attach God-like significance to created things. All people are worshipers. The human heart is wired for worship. And worship is not just about awe. Worship also involves giving yourself. Worship involves dedication to something. And so every human being is worshiping. They are dedicating themselves to something. They are giving themselves to something. The problem is it's usually creation rather than creator. Manitou, we all say. It is a god about things that are not truly God. Verse 14 says that Paul and Barnabas heard of it. How could they hear of it? They were right there. Well, did you see the answer earlier in verse 11? the people cried out in Lycaonian, in their local dialect, the gods have come down to us in the likeness of men. So I imagine most of you have been in the situation where people were speaking another language and you didn't know what was going on, but you knew they were talking about you. I remember preaching in a church, a Spanish-speaking church near the Bay Area in Northern California, and I can still picture Crystal and I sitting on the front row, and the pastor was talking about me, and the congregation was laughing, and Crystal and I were just smiling because we had no idea what was going on or what they were saying about us. So Paul and Barnabas knew something was going on, but they did not know the language. They could not understand what was happening. And so probably when the oxen showed up and the priest with the garlands, they said, "Oh, that's what's going on." Or maybe the crowds were sticking the garlands on their head or something like that. So verse 14, when Paul and Barnabas heard of it, they tore their garments and rushed out into the crowd, crying, "Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men of like nature with you." So let's look down now at this section in your chart. So you have, in Iconium, they faced opposition and had to respond with longevity and boldness. In Lystra, they faced deification and they needed humility. That's what goes in your blank, humility and boldness. Don't you think it took both things to run into that party at the city gates and say, "Stop it! We're men just like you"? They needed humility and boldness. Pharaoh once fell down at Joseph's feet, and Joseph said to him, "It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh his answer." Nebuchadnezzar, as we read last Sunday, commanded that offering and incense be offered for Daniel, but Daniel said, "There's a God in heaven who reveals mysteries." Earlier in Acts, Cornelius fell down at Peter's feet to worship him, but Peter, it says, picked him up and said, "Stand up, I too am a man." Now, that's boldness, to pick him up. And then in Revelation, John fell down to worship the angel, but the angel told him, "You must not do that. I am a fellow servant with you." Each of these had the humility to say, "Stop, don't give me what only God deserves. I'm not God. I'm just creation like you are." But verse 18 finishes this section by saying, "It hardly worked. They were scarcely able to persuade the crowds not to worship them." We come now to our final point. Paul and Barnabas brought good news for idolaters. Good news for idolaters. So let's go back, start in verse 14 again, and read through verse 17, the beginning of verse 17. Acts 14:14. "But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of it, they tore their garments and rushed out into the crowd, crying out, 'Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men of like nature with you, and we bring you good news.'" So that's what we're talking about now. "We bring you good news that you should turn from these vain things to a living God who made the heaven and the earth and the past generations and all that is in them, and the sea and all that is in them, In past generations he allowed all the nations to walk in their own ways, yet he did not leave himself without witness." Okay, so we bring you people who are having an idolatrous party because you think Zeus and Hermes just showed up, we bring you good news. What's the good news? That you should turn from these vain things to a living God. So 2 parts to the good news: a living God and turning to him. Let's start with a living God. It is good news that there is a living God. What does that mean? Well, first of all, it goes together with the phrase in verse 15, "We are men of like nature with you." The living God is in contrast with all the rest of us who just have the nature of human beings. We are just men, but there is a living God. Secondly, living God contrasts with the vain gods they were worshiping. What kind of gods do human beings imagine? We imagine exalted human beings. They're kind of like us, they're just better. Kind of like superheroes. But the true God is actually of a different category than us. That's why Paul says he made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. He's not a vain idol. He's not a human. He's not a super exalted human. He's the source of life itself. He's the creator. But don't you think there's probably one more thing Paul wanted to make sure they knew when he called God the living God? You think Paul said anything about the resurrection in Lystra in his preaching about the grace of Jesus there? So when he refers to the God as the living God, he's not just saying God is different from human beings like us. God is different from your gods, your super exalted human beings. God, he's also saying God sent his Son who has risen, who has defeated death, who holds the keys of death and hell, who someday is going to destroy death itself. He is the living God. That is good news. So that's the first part of the good news. There's a living God. The other part of the good news was that they should turn to him. And I think we should also, Paul's telling them they can turn to him. They don't need to be stuck in their vain worship. Now let me show you this in the logic of verses 16 and 17. I think this is the key to understanding why it's good news that they can turn to the living God. Verse 16, in past generations, God allowed all the nations to walk in their own ways, yet he didn't leave himself without a witness. Now, when you first read verse 16, does it sound a little odd to you? As if God once let people do whatever he wanted and he didn't care. Kids, have your parents ever said to you, you know, Mom and Dad are going to run out and do some errands, and while we're gone, you guys do anything you want, and we don't care? Anybody ever been told that? No? Now, there is a Bible theme about God looking over things in the past that we're going to talk about next Sunday, but I do not think that's what's being said here. And this definitely doesn't mean that in the past generations, God let other nations do whatever they wanted and he didn't care. Let me show you why that's not what it means. The key is to keep verse 16 with verse 17. In past generations, God allowed all the nations to walk in their own ways, yet they still had one kind of witness, and that was common grace. And so this is where it's vital for us to see three kinds of witness in this passage. The witness of the word, number one, the witness of signs and wonders, number two, and the witness of common grace, number three. Paul is saying that in past generations, some nations received just one witness, just the witness of common grace. They did not receive the word of God, and they did not see God's signs and wonders. They were never confronted by those things. God allowed them to walk in their own ways, and the only thing that confronted them was God's power and goodness as seen in creation. So the reason for the triangles on your handout is because they remind me of caution signs. These three witnesses are cautions. Cautions to people who are walking their own way, saying, stop, don't go your own way. In the past, the nations only had one caution sign: God's common grace, his goodness to all people. Romans 1, of course, explains that. The key here is to remember that when God allows you to just walk in your own ways, is he being, well, is that good or bad? Is that good or bad? What Romans 1 says is that is God's judgment. When God leaves you to walk your own way, that is judgment. And when God gives you a witness that confronts you and says, stop, that is kindness. And when God gives you three big caution signs, common grace, the spoken word, and the works of Jesus, when three big caution signs say, stop, don't keep going your own way, you need to turn to that God, because he is kindly not letting you just keep living your own way. He is giving you an opportunity to turn to to him. So this is what Paul is saying to the residents of Lystra. Look, in the past, God has allowed the nations to go their own way. And yeah, now God didn't leave himself without a big caution sign. His character, his works in creation, his common grace was still there to stop them. But now God has brought you 3 caution signs. You have heard about Jesus. You have seen the works of Jesus. So I've got good news. God has shown up in Lystra. Turn to him. Turn to the living God. I mentioned earlier that there was this ancient tradition that Zeus and Hermes had come to Lystra. That story had a sad ending. I don't know the details, but I think basically there were only a couple people in Lystra who recognized the gods when they showed up. And it's possible that the people of Lystra knew that story, and so they were thinking, hey, if the gods show up again, we're not going to miss it. We're not going to blow this again. So if these guys are Zeus and Hermes, we're going to throw the biggest worship party ever in their honor. And if it turns out this isn't Zeus and Hermes, well, better off safe than sorry. Do you know anyone whose view of God is better safe than sorry? It's the kind of person who says to you, hey, will you pray for me? I got all my religious friends praying for me. Like I've got this Mormon friend and I've got this Buddhist friend. And so if you'll pray for me too, that'd be awesome. What are they doing? Covering all their religious bases. Do you know anybody who's dabbled in several different religions to try to make sure they're good with God? They've got things taken care of? There is good news for those people. God has spoken in his Son. God has revealed himself in Jesus. You do not have to play better safe than sorry with religion. You can turn to the living God. He has made himself clear, and you can turn to him. So there was good news for idolaters. They didn't need to wait for the gods to come down because God had already come down in Jesus. They didn't need to look for a likeness of the gods because the exact representation of the Father had already come. They didn't need to hope that they would recognize the gods this time and not mess up like they did last time Zeus and Hermes came, because Jesus came and he revealed his grace and truth and unrivaled power, climaxing in his resurrection. You couldn't miss it. They didn't need to hope that they could make the gods happy with enough oxen and enough garlands of enough of a party. The sacrifice had already been offered for them. The oxen were not needed. The perfect sacrifice had already satisfied the wrath of God for them. What they did need to do was turn from worshiping the creation and turn to the one true God through Jesus. There was good news for idolaters. Folks, is this relevant? Are there billions of people in the world today who are worshiping creation? Dedicating themselves in worship to money or reputation or pleasure or comfort. Ignoring the Creator while worshiping his creation. Folks, there are billions of idolaters. Now, I'd like to close by considering this chapter, these themes, the good news for idolaters in I'd like to consider idolatry in 2 of its more subtle forms. I'd like to go right after us. Because we might think this chapter is a little bit irrelevant. Because, first of all, you're not probably likely to join an oxen sacrificing street party for Zeus. Not a big temptation for most of you. And second of all, if someone else tried to throw an oxen sacrificing street party for you, you probably would stop them too. So then does the story not apply? Boy, does it ever apply. Let me suggest 2 ways, and there are lots more. First, there might be times when people attach an almost God-like significance to us. They probably won't bring oxen. They probably won't bring garland. But they might be so thankful for us, so impressed with us, or so dependent on us, here's the thing, that they could more easily imagine living without God than living without us. As a matter of fact, they may not be thinking about God a whole lot because we are playing such a dominating role in their lives. Now, that can happen to any of us. You step in and love somebody who hasn't been loved, care for somebody who hasn't been cared for. And I'm not saying you can't care for someone very, very deeply and invest very, very deeply. I'm talking about when they start to feel like they could more easily live without God than without you. You're that important in their life. And in those times, we need the humble boldness to redirect their attention away from us to God, because we have to admit there is something down in our human nature that likes it. We don't mind a little bit of deification. And so it takes spirit-filled humility and boldness to say, I'm glad you're thankful, and I'm glad God's allowed me to be a blessing in your life, but please, I'm just a human like you. You and I are just at the foot of the cross together, that's all. And so I'm a sinner and I fail, and you really don't want to place your hope in me. Okay, I'm just God's instrument. So please don't give to me what only God deserves. You might actually have to say that to somebody sometime. And say it graciously, but say it with humble boldness. Please don't give to me what only God deserves. Now, I'm not saying that if you walk out here and somebody, has done something nice for you, or you've done something nice for someone and they say thank you, that you should say to them, please don't give to me what only God deserves. I'm not, okay, don't hyper-spiritualize this. I'm talking about when someone could more easily imagine living without God than living without you. And we need to sometimes stop that. Okay, that's one application, but here's a second. And this is what hit me just right away when I started working on this passage. Paul and Barnabas tore their clothes because people were treating them as gods. We are more likely to tear our clothes because people don't treat us like gods. We might get upset if someone doesn't listen to our advice or our wisdom that we try to give them. If someone doesn't respect our skills, our experience, how good we are at something, how many times we've done something, how we know how to do that. If someone defeats us at a game or a sport, if someone outdoes us on their performance evaluation at work, if someone praises somebody else instead of us, if someone questions us, corrects us, doubts us, our greatest idol is always self. We fight to defend self. And here's the thing, if you don't get anything else this morning, here's the one thing to get. The very things that we seem to defend for ourselves are characteristics of God alone. So when I rise up because someone else didn't listen to my advice, I'm actually rising up in defense of something that only applies to God. His is the only advice you should always take. Only God's wisdom should be respected all the time. Only God has skills and experience that demand ultimate respect. Only God can never be defeated, deserves all praise, never needs to be questioned, never needs correction, and shouldn't ever be doubted. And so when someone else doubts me and I'm upset about that, or someone else corrects me and I'm upset about that, I am actually defending for myself things that are only true of God. I am simply an idolater. Only God can do it all and fix it all and figure it all out. And so, there's actually another side to this. Our hearts are Weasley. Instead of getting upset at others who don't validate us as we wish, maybe your problem is you get so upset at yourself that you can't fix it all, figure it all out, and do it all. In other words, you get upset because you're not God. We tear our clothes because we discover we can't be God. when only God can do it all and fix it all and figure it all out in the first place? So is it possible that there are some idolaters here this morning who need the good news? Maybe you and I today need reminded about the good news that we don't have to be God. You don't have to figure it all out, and you don't have to fix it all, and you can't do it all. You don't have to defend your own wisdom and skills and experience and performance. You don't need to be able to do it all, fix it all, figure it all out. There is only one throne for one God, positions filled. And that one God sent his Son full of grace to die for us, to forgive us, to make us alive. This is such good news. The cross of Jesus can put an end to your fight for self, your defense of yourself, and your frustration that you can't be God. The cross of Jesus can put an end to those things. And you know what comes out of that? Restful humility. I will never forget reading A.W. Tozer years ago and just being so struck when he made the point that trying to defend yourself against other people and your reputation and all that is a burden nobody can carry. It is so heavy. There is good news for people who've made an idol out of themselves. There's only one God. Only one wisdom to defend, only one reputation to defend. It's not yours. That is good news. There is good news for people who really have thought that they were supposed to be God. You know, sometimes it's because your mom thought she was supposed to be God. You grew up in a home where mom tried to figure everything out, fix everything, do everything, or dad tried to defend a reputation as somebody who could fix everything, do everything, handle everything, and you were actually raised to think that's what you're supposed to do. And there is tremendously good news for you. You can't, and you don't need to try. You just need God. You need to humbly come to the cross of Jesus. And so the result of that good news for idolaters is a restful humility and a humble boldness to fight for his glory, not our own.